Good morning, friends, and a very warm welcome to our EduSite network. Our topic of discussion today is part of our series on writing in India, and the specific topic is 20th century Indian writing, a perspective. We have already discussed a part of this, and today is the second part of this specific lecture. And for this discussion, we have with us in our studio Dr. Anand Prakash, retired professor of English, University of Delhi. He has a teaching experience of more than 4 decades and currently is editing the Journal of Drama Studies and International Journal of Research on World Drama, and also say the Journal of Literature. And with this introduction, I would like to welcome sir and also request him to begin our today's lecture.
Thanks, Urushi, for this very kind introduction. The topic has already been partly discussed, friends, earlier, and today we take up the thread from where we left it last time. I went in the lecture earlier a bit deeper into the initial phases of Indian writing, particularly literary writing, but I also connected the writing with the times when it was produced, and in fact that's what the purpose of giving a perspective is. Let me clarify that perspective is a very important term for us in criticism, and in fact we believe that we have a position. Everybody who presents a point of view has a position from where one speaks, and that position helps the person to define the contours, the shape and size of the presentation, as also keeps one out of certain other things which are considered less relevant or less useful. So perspective means that it's my view, and I speak from a position, and whatever is left out is not a part of the perspective. So you can have, viewers, your own perspective, and you can say, well, that you look at it this way. So I'm presenting my perspective of the Indian writing, 20th century Indian writing, and this is the part 2, where I'll talk about the developments in culture, politics and society in India in the post-independence period, because that is a very decisive break that one sees in the writing as well as in the atmosphere of culture in India, and this break is to be emphasized and recognized in its features, etc. So I'll just go step by step. I will not name many authors or works, because that is a kind of giving information that is already available in the books, etc. But I'll be offering certain views to you to consider, to accept or reject or disagree with, and it is these views which will help us understand the appeal and the strength and the usefulness of what is known as literature. I, for instance, start by saying, and this is the first sentence that I read out from my notes, what we should consider initially is the decisive break in the position of the Indian writer in the mid-20th century. Now, the position of the Indian writer, that is important, because the position is that the writer is now talking from a different angle. From the early 20th century or late 19th century onwards up to 1947, the writer was talking from the point of view of a citizen, a second-rate citizen, a citizen of a colony, who was suppressed by, who felt suppressed by and oppressed by the colonial regime, and had to then devise ways and means to say what he or she had to say at that time. But as independence happened in 1947, then the position of the writer changed. The writer became more assertive. The writer became more self-assured. The writer started thinking of himself or herself as a citizen who is free and who can say things from one's own angle, and one would not be unnecessarily self-conscious about being a particular kind of a citizen. So this is the position from which the writer will start talking in literature from 1947 onwards. So this is the position that the writer takes. The writer is an independent citizen of an independent country, which has its own policies, which has its own preferences, and which has its own view of what is to be rejected. So that's the position, and this position is a very welcome position in literature, because literature is supposed to express only the genuine views, only those views which one finds what can be considered heartfelt, which is what you feel, which is what you see, and then you want to express that. So for that it is really very useful that one is an independent person, and will now then talk from that angle.
Sir, sorry to interrupt you, but certain observation I wanted to make. Very interestingly, you have put that post-independence, a writer is not so self-conscious, is not so afraid to say what they want to, and there's, like you said, there's perhaps a decisive break in the position of the writer post-independence. Of course, there's not a complete difference, but there's a clear difference in that sense. And so we notice different kinds of writing, say, can we say that there were people who were writing very enthusiastically, they were very happy about the partition, and there were certain writers, basically this section I mean to say happy about the partition in the sense that now their country is free and a lot of opportunities and possibilities are available for the citizens, and another set of writers who are writing about the agonies that people had to face due to the partition. And could we say that this was not happening before the partition, this kind of writing, it happened only after the partition, that people could freely write about the problems people faced, or another set of writers who are writing about the possibilities that are opened up for the general public?
Urvashi, you are raising a very important issue, and in fact when the colonial regime existed in India till 1947, the writer had to look in a very different sense at the implications of what one was writing. And when the country became free, then of course there were different problems, but then those problems would be sorted out by the writer oneself. And so far as the partition is concerned, partition is a part of, it's a kind of, it's a segment of experience that happened along with the attainment of freedom in India. And that was very painful. Most writers, because they were sensitive people and they didn't want, this kind of a cultural divide, social divide in the country. They didn't want Indians to go in the name of religion elsewhere, or pushed out of India in the name of religion. And then the other part is that the people who share the religious beliefs that we have, they are uprooted from their cultural and social background elsewhere, and they are compelled to come here and join us. So it's an issue that writers of the 20th century, mid 20th century, have grappled with, and a lot of writing is given to the theme of partition. But then partition is one area.
Right.
And the other area is that now the colonial masters, the people who ruled this country for close to 200 years, and very strictly and directly for a whole century, these people are no more there in the country, physically speaking. And I say physically because mentally, culturally, they would still be there. They left a state that state worked to the advantage of the colonial master, and that state was manned by officers and bureaucracy and other people in a manner that would support the colonial master, and the same people now had to shift their loyalties to India. And it is very difficult, viewers, to shift one's loyalties from one master to another. So that problem also was there. So in these mixed circumstances, the writing became crucial in terms of asserting what could be largely called Indianness. This Indianness would have been there earlier also, as you rightly suggested, that things didn't happen all of a sudden on one particular day. Communalism, for instance, in India would have been there in the 1930s and 40s, and there were Indian writers, who take cognizance of this. And the feelings of ill will and on religious and ethnic and other grounds, they would also be there. India was a class divided society right from the beginning. It still is. But then, the main plank of Indian writers till the attainment of freedom in India, that plank was anti-imperialist. That, even if we have divisions, even if we have differences among us, and those differences, are all the time giving us that sense of uncertainty, we would be one against a common enemy called the colonial regime. So that particular aspect of rejecting a whole regime, that disappears with the coming of independence in the year 1947. Things remain more or less the same, but then because the emphasis has changed, therefore certain drastic kind of developments will happen in culture and elsewhere. So it's a good point, and Vashi, that you have raised, that literature cannot be neatly divided into categories either of time, history, or politics. But then, even if there is a continuity with what has happened earlier, that continuity at least changes its shape with momentous developments like 1947, when the country becomes free. So there are two things, as you suggested. I didn't mention the word partition earlier, but if one has to think of partition, then one starts, in fact, asking this question from oneself, whether freedom was a pure affair, whether independence was a pure affair. In fact, there are some very effective and very eloquent Urdu writers in India, and I would name Majaz, who was there till 1945 or so, and there are others, and Krishan Chandra was there, for instance, Manto was there, and these people, were not happy at all that the country had become free, but it had become free with that kind of a tag, that it will be a country where Muslims would have no place, and they would have to, in fact, some of them go back to Pakistan to join their supposed community. They were anti-community in any case. The writers generally don't bother about religious beliefs and all. They believe about humanity and humanism, and this pain, was expressed quite strongly in their writing. I'll come to this, and this is a very problematic chapter in India's writing. So you are right in saying that things were there earlier, and they became clear at this point of time. And well, the very fact that 1947 happened, people at least could write very clearly about what they felt. So I complete this sentence now. Mid-20th century, Indian writer gets a break, and the year and the happenings accompanying it changed the overall structure of emphases, preferences, and thematic concerns. Themes will be now different. The theme will not be the throwing away of the enemy from India's borders, and they have to go back, and they can't make policies for us. We'll make our own policies, and we'll be free to do so. But then the other point that I also brought in was that physically they left, mentally they were here, psychologically they were here. They had left certain psychological propensities, psychological effects here, and a large number of upper class people in the higher echelons of bureaucracy, those people still spoke English, loved English, and they would always support things either indirectly or somehow clearly that the old regime was preferable to the one that came in later. So these things were there, and they were reflected in the dialogues, in the discussions, in the novels particularly, and the trend continued for some more time. So with this kind of a background, then I take up a few important features of this particular writing, Indian writing in India, Indian writing here, and which particularly takes shape in the 1950s onwards. And one feature that I refer to is the building of the nation. So this was a new area. Now, we had a responsibility to fulfill. Our responsibility was not merely to criticize the existing regime, but also to create conditions in which we would be able to fulfill our dreams. So let's build India, and India could be built, by increasing production, by going against casteism, by going against class oppression, etc. And national movement was a leveler. National movement called all of us Indians, and Gandhiji was there at that point of time saying, that there is nothing like Dalits, or there is nothing like the untouchables. Untouchability is a crime, and that actually the supposed the within quotes untouchables, they were actually very, very close to God, and they were called the children of God, Harijans, at that point of time. So this emphasis became much more clear after independence, and then this was a part of nation building. So nation had to be built, and I think one of the slogans, economic slogans at that time, which Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru in the 1950s gave to the nation, was that the modern temples of India were the industrial centers. They were not the temples where one would go and worship. They were the temples, which would stand at the base, and on which a whole nation will be erected. So building the nation was and in Hindi the word is Rashtra Nirman. So you do the Rashtra Nirman. You build a nation, and building a nation is as a slogan, it is all fine. But how do you build a nation? How do you bring people from two cultures together and give them a kind of identity which will be more Indian than either from Uttar Pradesh or Bihar or Bengal or South India. And well, all of us have to be Indians, so this kind of a feeling has to be built up now in the new context. So the first thing was of building the nation. Did the writers also say this, or was it said only by people? Now I don't make a distinction between the emotions of people and the writers. But then writers have this business of writing, and they can take up these themes in their writing. So if we go to the short stories, the poems, the novels written in the 1950s, then we realize that certain voices occur, certain characters occur in the writings themselves, and where what I'm saying it is also clearly taken up. People discuss this. There are novels in which discussions happen. I particularly refer to a novel which was written a little later, not in the 50s. It started being written in the 50s, but it was published in the early 60s. And this is a major novel, one of the most important novels that Hindi literature saw. And this novel is called Jhootha Sach. And it was in two parts, and Yashpal, the famous radical author Yashpal, who was opposing class oppression and who was giving a different class angle in his writing, he wrote this novel. And here he presents characters discussing India, discussing the building of India, discussing the weaknesses of India, presenting the pains and sufferings of the ordinary masses in the villages, in the small towns, and in the big towns. The action in this novel happens in Lahore, and Lahore is just on the border of Pakistan and India, and people will be gradually shifting from Lahore to India, or some people from India will be going to Lahore and other places, and Yashpal very deftly changes scenes in the novel. So he takes the reader to the villages, to the small towns, and somehow the idea of separatism, the idea of two kinds of nations, etc., that is also evolving at that time. So we see that India is building, but then this building is not uniform. It's not happening it's not a one-way street. The building also is visited by a large number of differences, and the writing of people is witness to this kind of a process, and that's what the new kind of emphasis is, that come what may, even if the country is divided, our job is to make it one country, and let's see how this can happen. And in fact, Nehru would be right in saying, that if you industrialize the country, then industry brings in occasions and opportunities where people from different walks of life, people from different regions of the country, they will come and work together. And if they work together in a factory for 5 years or 10 years, then they would forget about their ethnic distinctions, that they would live together, that they would have the same functions, that they would have the same, evenings to spend, etc. And therefore, a new kind of an India will emerge. Somebody gave the example of, going by a bus in a city, and when you go by a bus, then the class distinctions disappear. You never know who is sitting next to you on the seat of the bus. So the caste distinctions, when they get blurred, that is what industry does to us. That's what big towns do to us. That's what introduction of the bus service does to us. And this is what India was evolving as at that point of time. So the first thing was building the country. The second thing was carrying out social development. Social development has to be done, very consciously, in the sense, that literature particularly discusses society, discusses behavior patterns of people, and discusses decisions that people as characters in the novel make. Talks about the emotions in poems, which say directly to people what to believe in and what to reject. And the social development then takes us forward particularly towards a greater unity, and that is what social development is. So social development, in fact, is the antonym, is the opposite of social backwardness. Social backwardness, which still is the emotion is still ridden with orthodoxy. You believe in rituals, you believe in certain faith systems, and you don't want to come out of them. But then, when development occurs, when your mental horizon is widened, when you consider people as human beings, as friends, either real friends or potential friends, then of course social development has occurred. And I would particularly emphasize that in modern India, in the 20th century India, particularly post-independence, there will be large numbers of schools open for women, and that is called social development. So that a whole population, 50% of the population, is given a chance to educate itself, so that it can attain some sense of selfhood. It can have the capacity and the skill to work towards the building of the nation directly by being a part of it. Now, this is what social development is. If the education is not given to women, if education is not given to the poor people, then these people are left out of the fold of nation building. So social development is this, when society marches forward to a new kind of identity, and that happens through education, that happens through a kind of living where people discuss, debate, know how to differ and how to disagree, and then reach a consensus. So this is called social development, and viewers, you can look around your own environment. I look around at my own environment, and I see that in many cases social development has not occurred to the extent we would have liked it to occur. So which means it's a concern for literature, and in literature, writers would be emphasizing it again and again, whether society is developing, whether society is getting new ideas, whether society is being modernized. Society is not doing any idol worship. In fact, social development in the 19th century occurred in the context of movements like Brahmo Samaj movement in Bengal or Arya Samaj movement in North India, and they were saying things which Hindu orthodoxy, for instance, would not accept. So that was social development. Now that was taken much forward in the 1950s and 60s after independence. Then the third thing that I refer to is offering an alternative paradigm of self-search. This is important. There is very little self-search in the Indian writing in the pre-independence period, and understandably so. Of course, there are people, there are writers, great writers like Tagore and Premchand. They somehow pose questions, difficult questions to the characters, and characters face those questions themselves. But when mostly these writers want to unite the Indian citizen against a common kind of an enemy called the British imperialists at that point of time. But when British imperialists have left the country, then of course one can look inwards and see where one has faltered oneself. And you'll find that most of us make mistakes every day. We learn from our mistakes. We don't repeat our mistakes. We might make new mistakes later. And this is how self-search continues. And one of the vehicles of self-search is literature. Because in literature, one is not concerned mainly about what decisions one takes, but the process of decision, of taking a decision. And in the process, one thinks a great deal about the different pros and cons, and that thinking is that thinking involves self-search. So you will find that there is a great deal of self-consciousness in the writing of the 1950s. I can just refer to one example, CEC-UGC's poetry, written in the 1950s and 60s. This poetry talks about me and myself, the poet and himself. And in one of the poems, which is a very famous poem, he talks about the education of an individual and the influences that come from different directions. And these educations make him a kind of a person. Suppose he had not gone to a particular place, suppose he had not read certain authors, then the questions that he raises wouldn't have been there in his mind. So self-search is that way important, because self-search means that one is assessing one's nature, one's character, and one's faults, etc., so that one can come out of them. So this self-search became, it's an individual venture that became a hallmark of the Indian writing in the 1950s, which is post-independence. The next point that I refer to, Urvashi, do you have to say something about self-search?
Sir, absolutely. I was thinking about this and also thinking of the point you made about literature that emphasizes the idea of social development, that and you also gave the example of how schools, a number of schools were open for women, that 50% of the population also needed to be educated. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking of a certain writer that I read recently, Rokeya Sakawat-Hossain, and she, through her writing, makes a point that she sets out that the Muslim, she's writing to the Indian Muslims, and she said that if you keep say your women at the home, it automatically takes back a society a step backwards. In fact, you're halfway backwards if half your population is uneducated. And she also brings out points from the Quran, and she says that the idea was to bring out women and also to give them an equal footage and not to hold them back in the zenana. And of course the heroines that Rokeya Sakawat-Hossain takes up are in fact very independent, and the idea of self-search is quite embedded in her works. Mm. So as you were discussing this, I was thinking of the same, the idea of assertion and the idea of coming out and say putting up a point. And when the heroine makes a point, then all the women who are reading that are in fact motivated to also take a step. Mm-hmm. That is what I thought, sir.
No, this is exactly what I had in mind. And different writers, delve deep into these processes, and they make the reader aware about the problems that exist with respect to social development. So social development, this is the question that I generally bring in my discussions, that if we have to identify social development in society, then think of the state of the poor, think of the state of the weak, think of the state of women, and if they are happy, if they are safe, if they are comfortable, if they are given education, if they have a proper share in the resources of the country, then only society is said to be developed. So writers always work for this kind of a social development, where the emotions become more tolerant, where the ideas become more appreciative, where people sit together and discuss in a friendly atmosphere. That is social development. If people hate one another, if they criticize one another, if they come to blows on certain questions, etc., then that is not social development. That is social backwardness. So I would say that social development and backwardness, these are the two opposite poles of social existence, and this has to be emphasized again and again. And this has been emphasized again in literature of that period. Then reorientation of the nationalist struggle to take care of country's problems democratically. Now the nationalist struggle had to be now discussed in a manner that we took out certain important features of it and inculcated them in our behavior. National struggle was a glorious struggle. It bound India into one entity, and it gave us that kind of solidarity with one another. And whether it was northern part of India called Kashmir or the southern part of India called Kanyakumari, and both people from both the places, they became Indians, then that is what nationalist struggle, this kind of identity national struggle gave to the Indians. But then now what do we do democratically? Now that we make policies, now that we fight elections, now that different ideas clash with one another in the form of political parties and the resolutions, etc., then how will the nationalist struggle be viewed by the new audience? This is important. So in a way, earlier national struggle was an actual happening and we were a part of it. Now we have left it behind, and when we have left it behind, then we go to it, and then we realize whether we were wrong or right. And if we were right, then how to continue with that? So in a way, a reorientation of the nationalist struggle became important. For instance, there were certain issues which must have been brushed under the carpet, swept under the carpet, in the sense that you wouldn't bother about certain problems that Indians had with one another, because at that time you were fighting a common enemy. But after independence, we would have to bring those issues back to us. So inequality in society, that's an issue that the writers would start facing now in a new way, and they would look back to the national movement when inequality was not discussed. In fact, inequality as a fact was not at that point of time given much attention to. But now we have to give attention to inequality also. I can once again refer to another novel by Kamla Markandeya, Nectar and a Sieve, where the writer is talking about social inequality. And there is still an industry which is owned by an Englishman, and this industry is setting up its units in a village which was earlier peaceful, but now with the setting of the industry, the peace in the village is disturbed. So somebody is writing in the 50s and writing in order to tell the reader that peace is important, harmony is important, and that if you bring in capitalization, if you bring in the working of the capital in the country, if you bring in factories in the villages in such a manner that one person works to the detriment of social harmony, etc., and changes values in such a manner that everybody becomes an individual and one doesn't have any kind of social ties, then these writers start taking up new issues. Now this is the issue of nation building, that you want to build a nation, you bring in industry. But the industry is an individual venture. It's a private industry, and the private industry would not bother much about the social harmony. Therefore, if you have to have industry, then have it socially owned. You should have it nationally driven. You should have it in the hands of the people as a whole. It should cater to the demands of the people, not merely to the profit motive of the individual entrepreneur or the individual capitalist. This is what Nectar and a Sieve says, at the hands of Kamla Markandeya, and it's an important novel. Even today, it is taught in the universities courses, and it is discussed widely, and people relate to it. It's an old novel, but it's not an old novel, because things that the novel has discussed at that matter of time, those things still persist in India. So, and the novel is a part of the democratic process. The people in the class discuss it. Outside also, they might be feeling one with the emotion that is expressed in the novel, and that way, democratically, the writer is able to convey one's ideas. So, as soon as I find out that through my reading of literature that things are not as good, things are not as comfortable and convenient as I would like them to be, therefore you look back to the time when these issues first cropped up. So in a way, the national movement became a subject of discussion and debate and it had to be then reconstituted as a theory later, so that we derived strength from nationalism, after the independence has been achieved. And lastly, I refer to the feature of this writing, that studying, feeling, experiencing, and what can be called psychologizing, that became the part of the creative venture at that time. So in poetry, you would study certain features. In short story, you would highlight certain areas of experience, and you would not talk much about the ideas of people. You talk about the psychological states. Now these became due emphasis in the post-independence writing. I would have used this point later, but now that it has been mentioned here, let me tell you that particularly in Hindi writing of the 1950s and later, there was a sudden upsurge in the short story, not in the novel. Novels were written, but short stories were written more. And there was a whole movement called the new short story movement. And when the question was asked from these writers, why do they call it new short story? Then their answer was that this story is different from the traditional Indian short story. And by traditional Indian short story was meant the story that Premchand, for instance, would write. Premchand would make a character, think of a character, give him or her an issue, and at the end the issue is resolved and harmony is restored. This kind of a story was generally written, and it's also the structure of folk tale, that things always end on a happy note, or if there is a problem, that problem is finally resolved. Now these people who were a part of the new short story movement, they said, we will not like to have this kind of a beginning and this kind of an ending. We will not resolve things at the end. We will not give answers to the problems that we raise. What we do is, we will give people states of mind. We will not give ideas. So if somebody is suffering, that suffering is to be highlighted. If somebody is confused, that confusion is to be projected through the short story. And the story has to begin in the middle, and it has to end also in the middle. And they somehow tied themselves in knots, and they would always say that this is not the right kind of short story, this is not the modern kind of short story, and the short story has to be just very close to the experience of the people. Of course, that movement faded away very soon. It was there for 15-20 years. In the mid-1960s and early 70s, this story had given way to a different kind of a writing. But then there was a time when writers were asked not to write of any moral, not to write of any message, not to project any idea, but to express only the experience. So how would you react to this kind of
Sir, I would like to know, in these short stories that you're talking about, that a movement began, did they put up say the protagonist was faced by a dilemma? Was this dilemma resolved in the course of the story, or it kind of went on?
It went on.
Right.
The dilemma went on. The dilemma went on, and the person would be confused at the end also. And I have a hunch, I have an apprehension that this particular new short story, or new poetry for that matter,
right,
because there was Nai Kavita also at that time, this had its roots somewhere in the West.
Right.
Because the people in the West at that point of time had that movement called the theatre of the absurd,
yes,
or the
right,
writing of ennui and angst, etc. Existentialism was a strong force in Western literature. So that influence was coming here also, which did not believe in finding answers to problems, which in fact would not call questions problems. They would call them conditions that exist. And if the conditions are not to be questioned, then you have to suffer them. You have to just bear with them.
Right.
So
Sir, also could the writing style be similar to the stream of consciousness style, because the problem is not resolved, it kind of just goes on.
Yes, exactly. Because most of the new short story works, they will talk about the happenings that are there in the mind of the character.
Right.
So the characters think and they remember, and they go back into the memory, and they never come out of their own memories. So they start thinking about a problem, at the end also they are thinking, and in between many things have happened. So some kind of perspective is given, but that perspective is very passive perspective.
Right.
It doesn't move in any certain direction. If there is a movement in the mind of the person who is presented, that movement is circular movement. They come back to where they started from.
Right, sir.
So this is what happened in the short story of that time, and obviously, anyway, let me ask a question from you. Who would write this kind of a short story in any particular society? Tell me. Any idea?
I would say somebody who's really baffled, or somebody who's really say affected by a certain situation and is not able to find a resolution to it, or is so disturbed by it that he or she would want to sort of keep discussing it. And
okay, you use words bafflement, you use the word confusion, you use the word not reaching a solution, etc. Now such a person is a middle class person, and the situation of the middle class and the position of the middle class is the middle position. It's neither above nor below, neither left nor right. It is always at the center. It is looking in all directions, and it is being there where it is. So anyway, I'm just being literal, but then the middle class consciousness that took over the writing of the 1950s and 60s.
right.
And these people were educated, they were in touch with what happened in the West. They would read, sometimes they would translate from there, sometimes they would transfer ideas from there to the Indian languages, and they will merely interpret, and they will merely be. They were existentialists, most of them. Now there is the example of that Hindi writer who also wrote in English, but mainly he wrote in Hindi. S.H. Vatsyayan is called a gay also. So this person brought in the psychological aspect and the inner landscape of the character to the fore. And nobody discusses him with any seriousness today. He's not a point of inspiration today, but there was a time in the 1960s and 70s when he was a major figure in the Indian literary scene. So what I'm saying is that when the movements of this kind occur, then they are they draw attention to the class preferences of the characters of the writers who are there in those writings. So from now these are the features of the 20th century writing of the post-independence period, and from then on I'll be just taking up a few examples and then let you think about the problems that emerge from the discussion. For instance, there is a writer at the time of India's independence called Manto. Manto is also baffled, Manto is also full of pain, but then he takes a position against the forces which have caused the partition. He is critical of those forces. He is critical of religious beliefs. He is critical of the religious divide, and he is a humanist writer. He is a writer who believes that human beings should not be divided just along religious or communal lines. Then I also mentioned Yashpal earlier, and his Jhutha Sach is there. He wrote a large number of novels before and after Jhutha Sach, and in those writings, he was bringing in certain characters, their tendencies, etc., and then through them he would cast a critical glance at the society of the time. You have this Rahi Masoom Raza. He brought in the question of faith. He brought in the question of division, not merely in the cities but also in the villages. In fact, one of his famous novels is Adha Gaon. So why is the Adha Gaon? Why is not a Pura Gaon, a full village? And why is the division is at the core of the village? What has caused it? And the person is pained. Then you have Bhisham Sahni. He wrote that famous novel called Tamas, and Tamas means darkness, and a writer of the independence period, after independence, is not seeing any light. He's only seeing only tamas. He is only seeing any darkness there, and there isn't much hope in tamas. Hope is there only when people struggle against their predilections, when they struggle to unite, and when they feel pained, and when they're aware of the pain, then only there is some hope, but that's a distant hope. That hope, doesn't translate into any kind of change so far as the novel is concerned. And in fact, I would call all these writers not merely great writers, but realist writers, because their pains and sufferings, their kind of anxieties, etc., are rooted in the truth of the time when they were writing. Then there were writings which, as I said earlier, which reoriented the national movement and which gave a historical perspective. This writing also became quite famous in the post-independence period. And I just name a few writers like, Phanishwar Nath Renu. There is a writer in Hindi. There is a writer in Bangla called Vimal Mitra. There is another writer from Bangla, great novelist called Tarashankar Bandyopadhyay. They kind of present a history of India of the last 100 years or so, and how feudalism has finally given space to a new kind of culture, which is still worse than feudalism. So Vimal Mitra's Sahib Bibi or Ghulam, it was also filmed by Guru Dutt, and there you realize how feudalism is crumbling, and there seems to be no hope in the new development. And you have Tarashankar Bandyopadhyay, who is writing Ganadevta and other things, and Arogya Niketan is a famous novel by him, and he is talking of modernity replacing old ideas, and he's writing with hope also. So you have a different kind of writing at that point of time. Then you have the Urdu writers called Khwaja Ahmad Abbas, Krishan Chandra. You have a Hindi writer called Bhairav Prasad Gupta. You have an English writer called Bhavani Bhattacharya. And the distinctive feature of these writers is that they accept the class angle. No, not the caste angle, not the religious angle. They accept the class angle. They say that there is a class divide. There are people with money and there are people without money. And those who are without money, they have no scope of any progress in the country. And they also offer indirectly a resolution. And the resolution is that when classlessness is established, when every human being is treated equally, has full control over the national resources, then only society has some hope. So one realizes that this writing is not anxiety ridden. This writing is not a writing of bafflement. This writing is a writing of working for certain ideals, so that that lasting peace and harmony can be established in society. And one can give kudos to these writers. Krishan Chandra is not an ordinary writer. Khwaja Ahmad Abbas fought all his life for equality in society. Bhairav Prasad Gupta, the major Hindi novelist of the post-independence period, he brought in the very important political angle and the political dimension to writing. And he was completely against, the Naikani kind of people, who would shun ideas. He would say, no, don't shun ideas, you bring in ideas. You let the ideas clash with one another. And in the clash, they will shine. And the reader will be enlightened about the relevance of certain ideas in preference to others. So this writing also is there in the 20th century, and this emerged in the post-independence period. Then you have discussions, even though they doesn't move in the direction of a resolution, but then discussion itself shows that people want to really live and lead a vibrant kind of life. And this vibrancy is seen in writings of Bhagavati Charan Varma, a Hindi writer, and Amrit Lal Lagar, who also celebrates certain aspects of human behavior. Then there are many writers in the post-independence period who come from different parts of the country, and they recognize that even though certain areas are developing, certain others are not developing, and that the state of unevenness is there. There are pockets of backwardness and there are pockets of modernity. And one can give the example of modernity in the case of Kerala, where the literacy was 100%, and of West Bengal, where land reforms occurred in the 1960s and 70s, because of which people are far ahead of others in terms of their culture. Then after the now as I draw close to the discussion, I say that the kind of movement that continued from 1947 up to 1970. This movement gets a jolt in the 1975 when emergency is imposed in the country, when democracy is taken away from the masses, and writers, a new breed of writers emerged in the wake of the imposition of emergency. And the most important writer of the emergency era is the Indo-English writer Salman Rushdie. And he writes that Midnight Children, that famous novel, which is a talk of the town, which everybody now discusses it. And there he discusses the cynicism that was inherent in the emergency regime. And he from the position of criticism of the emergency, this person goes back to the time when the country became free. So he calls it the history of the nation, or the birth of a nation, or the biography of a nation. And the nation starts from 1947 and comes up to 1975 when emergency is imposed. So Midnight Children, this comes, and then a new group of writers who would be born in free India, who would be born sometime in the 1940s and 50s. These people would not have seen the national movement, but then they saw the India emerging from that angle, and because they were more privileged than many others, and their connection was not as much with the village as it was with the urban centers, and they had resources to go to the other parts of the world and get education there. And they had the advantage of comparing what happened in the West with what is happening in India, and within India also comparing what is happening in the urban centers with what is happening in the villages. So their vision, was much more enlarged, and they were critical of the colony, but they were also critical of the post-colony. So these people, they can be called post-colonial writers of the post-colonial period. Not merely, but also that they're critics of the post-colonial situation, also appreciators of it in certain respects. So novel, takes and writing in general, that takes a new form in the 1980s and 90s when the post-colonial era, in the literary terms, comes into existence. And now this particular writing is, focused in the metropolises of the world, and the medium is invariably is English in all this writing. So of course there are writings in Hindi and other languages which also bring in the post-colonial angle, but then the major post-colonial experience is caught in the English writing. And I can just briefly mention 2 or 3 writers here. Amitabh Ghosh is one writer, Vikram Sheth is another, Arundhati Roy is a third. And then these writers talk about once again the bafflement of the Indian citizen, but from a different angle. Now this bafflement is the bafflement of people who are caught in different kinds of thought strands. So I finish here because the picture is a bit more clear than before, but where it will lead us, that nobody can say, because it's becoming more and more fervent, and people are much more creative in the wake of post-colonial writing than they were earlier. And it's anybody's guess where this kind of a writing will lead us finally. So with this, in an open-ended manner, I present the argument.
Thank you so much, sir, for this very interesting discussion and lecture of ours. In fact, it was the second part of carrying forward from our previous lecture that we had on 20th century Indian writing, a perspective. And I would like to tell our viewers that tomorrow we shall be having a lecture on Lal Ded. And because we do not have any time for discussion, perhaps you could carry on the questions for later. Of course, I have a few questions which I could ask sir tomorrow at the beginning. And with this, I would like to thank sir for being here. Thank you so much, sir. And thank you viewers for watching. Have a wonderful, great day.